So here's the final quiz for Chapter 17. Chapter 17 asks a bunch of questions, even though you don't go through all those questions. The questions that are in this test bank here that I cover are questions that I actually cover through the notes through other parts of this class. So don't worry about every single part of Chapter 17 or if there is no notes associated with the Chapter 17. It's really stuff that you should have seen in previous notes of the previous chapter. So suppose that the central bank must follow a rule that requires it to increase the money supply when the price level falls and decrease the money supply when the price level rises. If we just focus on this rule here, it's this idea that to keep inflation rates low and stable. If the price level were to fall, you want to increase money supply to make it prop up again. And when there is going to be high levels of inflation, we want to try to slow it down to not have high levels of inflation, all enacting in the goal of the central bank to keep inflation rates low and stable. If the economy starts from long-run equilibrium and aggregate supply shifts left, so if you were to draw it out, you would have those graphs, and as aggregate supply would shift left, you would be in the situation where you have a less performing economy in terms of output. So stagnating economy and some inflation, so you'd have that stagflation part. Well, in that situation there, because the price levels go up due to this aggregate supply curve shifting left, if they were to follow this rule, they need to drop money supply. As they do this, aggregate demand would also shift left to bring the price level back to where it was, but it's going to shift the economy even further away from the long-run level and further into a recession. If you're not sure about this, draw it out and you will see. So shift the aggregate supply curve left first, and then you'll have to shift the aggregate demand curve left afterwards to bring the price level back to where it was initially, but you'll see that output will be further away. So the central bank must decrease the money supply, which will move output further from its long-run level. There are ways that policymakers could reduce the cost of inflation without reducing inflation. This is true. Cost of inflation, there is, many costs and shoe leather costs, but there's also costs associated with letting inflation rates fluctuate greatly over time. So we can reduce some costs of inflation by keeping inflation rates low and stable. So there's none of these unexpected increases and decrease on inflation costs. So this is true. How would a permanent reduction in inflation impact menu costs and employment? So I'm not sure. It would temporarily reduce menu costs. Now, if this is a permanent reduction, this would be a permanent reduction in menu costs. And actually, the one that I clicked on by mistake is the right answer. Permanent reduction in menu costs and temporary raise in unemployment. As this, it's the same kind of idea as when we're the cost of reducing inflation levels. Well, for a certain amount of time, it's going to lead to a certain drop in output, which is going to lead to a rise in unemployment. So permanent drop in menu costs, but a temporary rise in unemployment. Why should policymakers not try to stabilize the economy? Well, the example that we had before, that we might shift it away further, is a good answer. But let's look at these ones here. Economic conditions can easily change between the time when a policy action begins and when it takes effect. This is the right answer here, because one of the reasons why we sometimes promote not stabilizing the economy is that we've seen in class that monetary policy could take at least a full year to come into effect. So a drop in interest rate can take a long time before it actually influences investment and GDP. And by that time, maybe the economy already recovered, and now you're throwing it into a boom phase instead of just bringing it back. So that's pretty much it. Recessions represent a waste of resources. That's true, but it's not a reason why we shouldn't stabilize the economy. Pessimism on the part of households and firms may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, that's a reason why we want to bring the economy back to full employment. Leaning against the wind doesn't make any sense. We haven't talked about that. In which situation is a program to reduce inflation likely to have the highest costs? Well, this is linked a little bit to the question in chapter 16. If the sacrifice ratio, that kind of ratio in terms of lost GDP, is the highest, it's going to be a problem. So if the sacrifice ratio is high and the reduction is unexpected, so even though we could say some agents are rational, if they don't expect it to happen and the sacrifice ratio is high, it's going to lead to high inflation costs. So hopefully all those questions in all of the chapters for the practice quizzes are clear for the exams and that you're good to go. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out and ask me. Thank you.